Have you ever heard a sound that wasn't there? Not a ringing in your ears, not a trick of the acoustics. I'm talking about a sound that echoes in the empty spaces of your mind. A sound that whispers in the dead of night. A sound that makes your blood run cold. A sound that shouldn't exist, but does. A sound that haunts. I'm going to tell you about a sound I heard. It wasn't just a noise, it was a message. A message from somewhere else. Somewhere dark. It started on a night like this. Rain lashed against the windows, a furious drumming that mirrored the frantic beat of my heart. The wind howled like a banshee, clawing at the eaves, whispering secrets I didn't want to hear. Secrets about what hides in the shadows, what lurks just beyond the edge of our perception. Secrets about what happens when we're alone, vulnerable, lost in the darkness. That night, the darkness felt different. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was something else. Something heavy, something thick, something that pressed down on me, stealing my breath, filling me with a dread so profound that I could taste it. And then there was the sound. It started small, almost imperceptible. A scratch, a faint rustle, easily dismissed as the wind or a loose branch. It grew louder, more insistent, until it became a constant, gnawing presence in the silence. A sound that burrowed into my mind, a sound that made my blood run cold. A sound that I'll never forget. Because that sound told a story. A story about a house, about a girl, about a night drenched in fear. A story that I'm going to share with you now. So, turn down the lights, pull the covers tight, and listen closely. Because what I heard that night, you might just hear it too. And once you hear it, you'll never look at a rainy night the same way again. The house stood on Hemlock Street, number 13. A fact that Elara had dismissed as mere coincidence, a silly superstition. But as the storm raged outside, the number 13 seemed to loom larger, casting a long, ominous shadow over the already unsettling atmosphere. The house itself was a relic of a bygone era, a Victorian monstrosity with gables and turrets and a general air of neglect. Its paint peeled in long, curling strips, like sunburnt skin flaking away, revealing the bare wood beneath, weathered and gray. The windows, dark and vacant, stared out onto the street like the eyes of a long-dead soul, reflecting the distorted glow of the street lights and the relentless downpour of rain. The garden, once meticulously manicured according to local lore, was now overgrown and wild, a tangled mess of weeds and thorny bushes that clawed at the house like grasping hands. A single gnarled oak tree stood sentinel in the front yard, its branches reaching out like skeletal arms, swaying and groaning in the wind. Locals whispered stories about the house, tales of strange occurrences, unexplained noises, a feeling of wrongness. They spoke of a family tragedy, a dark secret buried within its walls, a lingering presence that refused to leave. But Elara, a college student with a pragmatic mind, dismissed these stories as folklore, the product of overactive imaginations and small-town gossip. She was a woman of logic, of reason, of the tangible world. She didn't believe in ghosts or goblins or things that went bump in the night. She believed in science, in facts, in explanations. Which is why she chose to spend the weekend alone in that old house, a quiet retreat, a sanctuary from the noise and distractions of campus life. She needed to focus, to prepare for her upcoming exams, and the secluded house on Hemlock Street seemed like the perfect place. Besides, she told herself, a little solitude would do her good. She needed time to herself, time to think, time to breathe. The storm had rolled in that afternoon, a dark and brooding presence that seemed to settle over the entire town. The sky turned an ominous shade of gray, the air grew heady and thick, and the wind began to pick up, whispering through the trees like a restless spirit. Elara wasn't particularly worried. She'd weathered worse storms. She'd grown up in this town, accustomed to its unpredictable weather, its sudden downpours, its fierce winds. Besides, she wasn't entirely alone. She had Midnight, her sleek black cat, curled up on the sofa beside her, a warm, purring presence in the otherwise empty house. Midnight was her companion, her familiar, a source of comfort in the growing unease. Elara tried to focus on her books, to immerse herself in her studies, but the storm kept distracting her. The rain hammered against the windows, a relentless barrage sound, a constant reminder of the tempest raging outside. The wind howled like a banshee, clawing at the eaves, rattling the window panes, and making the old house groan and creak around her, settling deeper into its bones. Every now and then, she'd hear a thump from upstairs, a settling sound. She told herself, a perfectly reasonable explanation for the noises in an old, creaky house. But the house was old, and its secrets were many. And tonight, as the storm raged outside, some of those secrets were about to be revealed. Tonight, Elara's logic, her reason, her belief in the tangible world was about to be tested. The air in the house had grown thick, heavy with a sense of unease that Elara couldn't shake. It wasn't just the storm, though the rain continued its relentless assault. Each drop a tiny drumbeat against the window panes, a constant reminder of the tempest raging outside. It was something else, something colder, something that seeped into her bones and made the hairs on her arms stand on end. The scratching from the attic, now louder, more insistent, was like a fingernail scraping across a chalkboard, a sound that grated on her nerves and sent shivers down her spine. It wasn't just the sound itself, but the implications of it, the suggestion of something moving, something living in the darkness above. Midnight, her usually calm and collected companion, was acting strangely. He paced back and forth, his tail twitching, his eyes wide and dilated. He kept hissing, a low, guttural sound that Elara had never heard from him before. He would stop every few moments, his gaze fixed on the ceiling, on the attic door, as if he could see something, but she couldn't. His behavior amplified Elara's fear, confirming her worst suspicions. She wasn't alone in the house. Something was up there. Something was wrong. She tried to rationalize it, to tell herself that it was just her imagination, that the storm was making her jumpy, that she was letting her fears get the better of her. She thought of the old house, its creaky floors, its drafty windows, its history of neglect. She told herself that the scratching was probably just a loose branch scraping against a roof, or maybe a squirrel trapped in the attic. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. She could feel it in the air, a shift in the atmosphere, a heavy, oppressive presence that made her feel like she was being watched. The silence between the gusts of wind, between the cracks of thunder, was even more unsettling than the storm itself. It was a thick, heavy silence, a silence that seemed to press down on her, stealing her breath. In that silence, she could hear the beating of her own heart, a frantic drumbeat against the encroaching darkness. She gripped the candle tighter, its small flame flickering nervously in the still air, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The shadows seemed to move on their own, twisting familiar shapes into grotesque figures, playing tricks on her eyes. Every creak of the floorboards beneath her feet echoed through the silent house, each step a monumental effort. She moved slowly, cautiously, her senses on high alert. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, she paused, listening. The scratching had started again, louder now, more insistent. It was definitely coming from the attic, a rhythmic scraping sound that made her skin crawl. It sounded like nails on wood, or perhaps something dragging across the floor. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. She told herself it was just her imagination, that the storm was making her nervous, that she was letting her fears get the better of her. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. She could feel it in the air, a shift in the atmosphere, a heavy, oppressive presence that made her feel like she was being watched. She started to climb the stairs, each step creaking beneath her weight, the sound echoing through the silent house like a death knell. The candle flickered, casting grotesque shadows on the walls, making the familiar staircase seem alien and menacing. As she ascended, the scratching grew louder, more frantic, until it seemed to be coming from right above her head. She paused on the landing, her hand trembling as he held the candle aloft. The scratching stopped abruptly, and a heavy silence descended, broken only by the relentless rain and the howling wind. And then she heard it, a whisper, barely audible, a faint murmur that seemed to slither through the cracks in the walls. She couldn't make out what it was saying, but the very sound of it, the hushed, eerie tone, sent chills down her spine. Midnight hissed again, his eyes still fixed on the attic door. Elara's heart pounded in her chest. She had to go up there. She had to know what was making those sounds. But as she reached for the attic door, a part of her, a small, terrified part, wanted to turn back, to run, to escape. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. The whispering continued, a low, sibilant sound that seemed to be calling her name. The attic door swung inward with a groan, a sound that seemed to echo the unease in Elara's soul. A wave of icy air washed over her, carrying the cloying scent of dust and decay, the smell of forgotten things, of time itself slowly eroding. It was a smell that spoke of secrets, of things best left undisturbed. Elara hesitated on the threshold, the candle flame dancing nervously in her trembling hand, casting grotesque shadows that writhed and contorted on the sloping walls. The attic loomed before her, a vast cavernous space, filled with the ghostly shapes of furniture shrouded in white sheets, like silent witnesses to some long-forgotten tragedy. Dust motes, disturbed by her intrusion, swirled in the air, catching the flickering candlelight and creating an ethereal, almost dreamlike atmosphere. But this was no dream. This was real. The coldness in the air, the oppressive silence, the feeling of being watched, these were not products of her imagination. They were tangible, real, and terrifying. Elara took a tentative step into the attic, the floorboards groaning beneath her weight, each creak a sharp stab of fear. The scratching sound had stopped again, but the silence that followed was even more unnerving. It was a silence pregnant with anticipation, a silence that hummed with an unseen energy. She held the candle higher, trying to pierce the darkness, but the shadows seemed to resist the light, clinging to the corners of the room, concealing whatever might be lurking there. She thought she saw movement in the periphery of her vision, fleeting glimpses of shapes shifting in the darkness, but every time she tried to focus, they vanished, leaving her wondering if she was just imagining things. Her heart pounded in her chest, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. She felt the blood rushing through her veins, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She took another step, then another, drawn forward by a morbid curiosity, a desperate need to know what was making those sounds, what was hiding in the shadows. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping noticeably, as if an unseen presence was sucking the warmth from the room. Elara shivered, not just from the cold, but from a deep, primal fear that resonated in her very bones. She felt a distinct sensation of being watched, as if unseen eyes were following her every move, scrutinizing her, judging her. She turned slowly, scanning the shadows, but saw nothing. The only sound was the relentless rain outside and the frantic beating of her own heart. The scratching started again, this time closer, louder, sending shivers down her spine. It was coming from the far corner of the attic, a dark, shadowy recess that seemed to absorb the light from her candle. She held the candle aloft, trying to pierce the darkness, but the shadows swirled and shifted, making it impossible to see clearly. She thought she saw something move in the shadows, a fleeting glimpse of a shape, a figure, but it was gone in an instant, leaving her wondering if it was just her imagination. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears like a drum. She could feel the blood rushing through her veins, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The whispering started again, this time clearer, almost like a voice. She still couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a voice filled with malice, with a dark, malevolent intent. It was a voice that chilled her to the bone. She took another step forward, drawn by a morbid curiosity, a desperate need to know what was lurking in the shadows. The candle flame flickered again, frightening to go out, plunging her into complete darkness. She cupped her hand around the flame, trying to protect it from the drafts. As she did, she noticed something on the floor, a dark stain that looked like blood, her breath caught in her throat. She followed the stain with her eyes, and it led her to the dark corner of the attic, the place where the scratching was coming from. She could feel the presence there, a cold, heavy feeling that made her skin crawl. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that whatever was in that corner, it wasn't human. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and Elara could almost make out the words now. They were calling her name. Elara, the voice whispered, a low, sibiling sound that echoed through the attic, sending shivers down her spine. She knew she had to get out of there. She had to escape. But as she turned to leave, she saw something in the shadows. Two eyes, glowing in the darkness, staring directly at her. And then, the candle went out. The darkness wasn't just the absence of light. It was a tangible presence, a thick, suffocating blanket that smothered all sense of reality. It pressed down on Elara, stealing her breath, filling her with a terror so profound that it transcended mere fear. It was a primal dread, the kind that resonates deep within the ancient parts of the brain, the part that remembers the darkness before fire, the part that understands the vulnerability of being alone in the dark. She stumbled backward, her hands outstretched, groping blindly in the void, trying to find some point of reference, some escape from the suffocating blackness. The scratching, no longer just a sound, but a physical vibration that resonated through the floorboards and into her bones, was closer now, directly in front of her, emanating from the deepest, darkest corner of the attic. It wasn't just scratching anymore. It was a tearing, a ripping, a sound that spoke of violence, of something being shredded, consumed. It was the sound of something, feeding. She could feel the presence in the darkness, a cold, heavy weight that pressed down on her, stealing her breath, making her heart pound in her chest like a trapped bird. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a knowing. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the marrow that she was not alone. Something was there with her in the darkness. Something ancient, something malevolent, something inhuman. She could almost feel its breath on her, a cold, fetid breath that smelled of damp earth and decay, the smell of the grave. The whispering started again, no longer a murmur but a clear, distinct voice, a voice that spoke her name with chilling familiarity. Elara, it hissed, the sound slithering through the darkness, wrapping around her like a serpent, constricting her, stealing her will to fight. Elara, it whispered again, closer this time, right beside her ear, a breathy, chilling whisper that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She screamed, a raw, primal sound that was swallowed by the darkness, absorbed by the oppressive silence that followed. She stumbled backward, her hands outstretched, trying to fend off the unseen presence, trying to create some distance between herself and the thing that lurked in the shadows. She could feel it moving around her, a cold, shadowy figure that danced just beyond the edge of her perception, always just out of reach, always just a step behind. She lashed out, her hands connecting with something solid, something cold, something fleshy. It was soft, yet firm, like decaying flesh beneath clammy skin. She recoiled in horror, her scream escalating into a terrified shriek. The scratching intensified, becoming a frenzied tearing, a sound that made her blood run cold. She could hear something moving in the darkness, something large, something powerful. It was close now, so close she could feel its breath on her skin, a cold, clammy breath that smelled of death, of rot, of something ancient and unclean. The whispering became a guttural growl, a sound that resonated deep within her soul, a sound that spoke of pure evil, of a hunger that could never be satisfied. Elara, it growled, the voice filled with a malevolent intent that made her want to crawl out of her skin, to disappear, to cease to exist. She screamed again, her voice raw and broken, a desperate plea for mercy. A futile attempt to ward off the inevitable. She closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable, for the touch of the thing that lurked in the darkness, and then it touched her. A cold, clammy hand closed around her arm, its grip like iron, its fingers digging into her flesh. She screamed again, her voice cracking, her body trembling uncontrollably. She tried to pull away, to break free from its grasp, but the grip was too strong. It was as if she was trapped in a nightmare, unable to move, unable to escape. She could feel the creature pulling her closer, dragging her towards the darkness, towards the source of the scratching, towards the thing that had been whispering her name. She opened her eyes, and in the briefest of flashes, illuminated by a sudden burst of lightning outside, she saw it. A distorted figure, tall and gaunt, its skin stretched taut over its bones, its eyes glowing red in the darkness, burning with a malevolent light. Its mouth was a gaping maw, filled with sharp, jagged teeth, like the teeth of some predatory animal. It lunged at her, its breath hot and fetid on her face, a wave of pure evil washing over her. She screamed one last time, a scream that was cut short by the darkness, by the cold, by the nothingness. The scratching reached a crescendo, a frantic, tearing sound that seemed to rip the very fabric of reality. And then silence. A silence so profound, so absolute, that it was more terrifying than any sound. A silence that spoke of finality, of the end, a silence that remained. The silence that followed Elara's final scream was not a peaceful silence. It was a heavy, oppressive silence. A silence that hummed with an unseen energy, a silence that felt watched. It was the kind of silence that descends after a storm, a brief respite before the next onslaught. But this silence was different. This silence was final. The scratching had ceased. The guttural growls had faded into the echoing chambers of the attic, and Elara's screams, once so piercing, were now just a memory, a chilling echo in the vast emptiness. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting to see what would happen next. As if anticipating the next victim, the next scream, the next descent into darkness. But nothing happened. The rain continued its relentless drumming against the window panes, a mournful rhythm that seemed to mock the stillness within the house. The wind howled outside, a mournful dirge that carried the whispers of forgotten things, of secrets it buried deep within the earth, of tragedies that time could not erase. The darkness remained, thick and impenetrable, a shroud that concealed whatever horrors lie within the attic, a void that swallowed all light, all hope, all sense of reality. There was no dramatic resolution, no final confrontation, no satisfying conclusion. There was only the silence, a rain, and the lingering presence of something unnatural. Something that had taken root in the house. Something that had claimed the attic as its own. What happened to Elara that night? Did she succumb to the creature of the darkness? Was she dragged into the shadows, becoming another victim of the house's dark secrets? Another name whispered in the wind? Did her screams join the chorus of other screams that echoed through the empty rooms? A symphony of terror that played out every night, unseen, unheard, except by the watchful eyes of the house itself? Or did she somehow escape, fleeing into the storm, forever haunted by the memories of what she had encountered in the attic, forever marked by the cold touch of the thing that had whispered her name in the darkness? Did she carry the terror with her, a constant companion, a shadow that followed her every step, reminding her of the horrors that lurked just beyond the veil of the ordinary? We may never know for sure. The house on Hemlock Street remains silent, its secrets locked within its walls, its darkness concealing the truth, its silence a chilling testament to the events of that night. The stories persist, whispered in hushed tones around campfires, passed down through generations like a dark inheritance. They say the house is still haunted, that Elara's screams can still be heard echoing through the empty rooms, carried on the wind, mingling with the sound of the rain. They say that the scratching continues, a constant rhythmic scraping that emanates from the attic, a chilling reminder of the creature that resides there, waiting, watching, hungry. They say that the attic door sometimes creaks open on its own, revealing nothing but darkness, an impenetrable void that seems to suck the light from the room. But if you listen closely, if you dare to listen, you can still hear the whispering. A faint, chilling whisper that calls Elara's name. A whisper that promises that the darkness never truly sleeps. That the horrors of that night are not confined to the walls of the old house. They say that midnight, the black cat, Elara's companion, her familiar, remains a constant presence at the window, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked glass, as if he can still see something that we can't. He watches, he waits, he remembers. He remembers the scratching, the growls, the screams. He remembers the cold, the darkness, the presence of evil. And sometimes, late at night, when the rain is falling and the wind is howling, when the world is quiet and the shadows are deep, if you listen very carefully, if you dare to listen, you might just hear it too. The scratching, the whispering, the sound of something moving in the darkness. The sound of something waiting. What do you think happened to Elara that night? Was it all in her head, a product of her imagination, fueled by the storm and the local legends, a manifestation of her deepest fears? Or was there something more, something truly malevolent, something that transcended the boundaries of the natural world? Was it the house itself, imbued with some dark energy, some lingering presence of past tragedies? Or was it something else entirely, something ancient, something that had been waiting for centuries, patiently biding its time until it found its next victim? Share your theories in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. What do you believe lurks in the darkness? And if this story gave you chills, if it made you look over your shoulder in the dark, if it made you question the silence and the shadows, then please like this video, subscribe to my channel for more true horror stories, and share it with your friends. Let them experience the terror. Let them hear the whispering. Let them feel the chill that settles in your bones when you realize that you're not alone. And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on future tales of the macabre, future explorations into the darkest corners of the human psyche. Because the darkness is always listening, and it might just have a story to tell you next. A story that will make you question everything you think you know about the night, about the silence, about the things that go bump in the dark. A story that will make you realize that sometimes the greatest horrors are not the ones we see. They're the ones we hear, the ones we feel, the ones that whisper our name in the darkness.